We're going to take a look at public lands and talk a little bit about them. All countries do have them, and we're going to spend a little time talking about how they're categorized, primarily based on how they're used. If you take a look here at this map, you can see that about 11% of the planet is protected in one way or another. And we're going to look at how the United Nations breaks these areas down into 6 different categories. So if you look here, these 6 categories, this is the United Nations list of protected areas, and they do categorize public lands based on how they're used into one of these 6 categories. So we're going to take a look at these one at a time. National parks, we've got about 3,400 of them in the world, and in most cases we don't allow commercial logging in these areas. We don't allow mining in these areas. They're there mainly for protecting biodiversity and keeping ecosystems intact, as well as allowing for some tourism and for their aesthetic beauty. There is a negative side, however, in creating some national parks and maintaining some national parks. There have been cases where indigenous groups have been evicted and excluded from those areas. And that is Yosemite National Park out in California. Managed resource protected areas. These are areas that do allow for some mining, some commercial timber harvesting or logging, as well as some recreational uses. Everything ranging from hiking, horseback riding to, in some cases, even ATV use. A great example in the United States for a managed resource protected area would be our national forests. And here's a picture of Sumter National Forest right here in South Carolina. Habitat and species management areas, well, they're there to protect species, as they sound, obviously, or maintain biological communities. Sometimes with fire prevention, sometimes with predator control. This picture is Lake Woodruff, which is just west of Daytona in Florida, and it's important. It's an important area for migratory birds, so it's been protected for that purpose. Strict nature reserves and wilderness areas. Um, these are areas that we think of as probably the most protected. Um, they're usually there to protect species and even entire ecosystems. Um, Protection from hunting and habitat destruction, even just hybridization or interbreeding with domesticated animals. And that's a picture of me in Denali National Forest, but also the Denali Wilderness Preserve, it's a very large area surrounding the highest peak on our continent. Protected landscapes and seascapes. Um, these are a mixed use thing because we get into, you can use the natural resources, yet we protect them. So within these areas, a lot of times you'll find things like villages and beaches and orchards, things that you would associate typically with tourism, but they're also protected from different types of development and anything that may be destructive to those areas. This image here is just off the coast of Greenland. National monuments be our last category, and these are areas that have been set aside because they have cultural interest. They play a significant role culturally, or even they can be of natural interest as well. These two happen to be of cultural interest. The Arc de Triomphe in France is something you see in the background in Paris during certainly at the end of the Tour de France. And then a little bit closer to home, we have Fort Sumter right here in Charleston Harbor. So now we're just going to focus on the United States, even though a lot of my examples were within the United States. Those were the United Nations global assignments, or categories rather, for public lands. Um, and if you take a look at the country, not in this map, but about 42% of the lands in the United States are owned by state, local, or the federal government. This map shows public lands held by the federal government. And as you can imagine here, the federal government is the single largest uh, landowner. And the federal government owns about 25% of the land in the country. Most of that, over half of that, is in the western United States. And 37% of that is in Alaska. Um, so public lands in the U.S. include everything from rangelands to national parks and wilderness areas. Uh, but there's competing interests for how these lands should be used since they are publicly held and basically they belong to everyone. Um, Policymakers are supposed to base their decisions, at least partly anyway, on what we call the resource conservation ethic. And this is the idea that we have to maximize the use of this resource or the use of these lands based on what's going to serve the greatest good for everyone. And that's oftentimes difficult to define. Um, so it's meant that some places have been preserved and managed for a whole bunch of reasons. It could be aesthetic, scientific, uh, economic, recreational, all of those purposes in one land area. And we call such lands multiple use lands. And those are lands where we're trying to get the greatest amount of uses to address these competing interests for land use. So again, with multiple use lands, we could be talking about things like grazing and timber harvesting and mining, all within one area. Um, Other areas we're going to just, well, flat out protect. So let's say if we're around a watershed, we may want to do that, or just to preserve wildlife and fish populations, or to maintain those places that are of historical value, as we saw in some of those previous slides. So the last thing I want to talk about would be these four federal agencies. These four federal agencies manage about 95% of all federal lands. So these are the ones that I want us to focus on for our class. Oftentimes we see them referred to by their initials. Certainly lands that are maintained by the, or managed rather, by the Bureau of Land Management are oftentimes called BLM lands. But you do need to know what those initials stand for as well. So the Bureau of Land Management, or BLM lands, can be used rather, for grazing, mining, logging or timber harvesting, and recreation. U.S. Forest Service lands can be used for, again, commercial logging or timber harvesting, um, as well as for grazing and recreation. National Park Service, going to be primarily limited to recreation and conservation. And Fish and Wildlife Service lands are used for, well, wildlife conservation, hunting, and recreation. So that covers our section on categories of land use. Um, as always, please feel free to ask questions either online or in class. Thanks for tuning in.